All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our second session for Discovery Day Online. Today is all about making monsters. We're looking at how we take science and art and combine them to bring ancient and in today's case, fictional worlds to life. I'm really excited to have our second guest for today, Cullen Townsend. So Cullen is a science illustrator and artist. He is a Southern Californian artist and local with a passion for art and natural history. He aims to bridge the gap between art and science, communicating subjects that captivate and inspire him to create. Hi, Cullen. Welcome to Discovery Day Online.
Hi, Gabe. It's great to be here. I'm Cullen. Full disclosure, I am not a paleontologist. I have no real formal training in paleontology, but I've always loved art and drawing dinosaurs for as long as I can remember. And I'm new to professional paleo art, but I was lucky enough to be able to work with the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles recently on a upcoming exhibit, and that's kind of what I will be presenting today. And so I guess the first question I have to answer is for anybody who doesn't know me, saying that I'm not a paleontologist is, have I always loved uh, prehistoric creatures and prehistoric things? And the answer is yes, an emphatic yes. I have literally always been interested in paleontology, anything that was prehistoric. And for as long as I've loved dinosaurs, I have loved drawing dinosaurs. Um, my artwork, I'd like to say, is pretty much inspired by some of the greats of the early 90s, like Mark Hallett and Doug Henderson. I really like to try and capture a story in a picture if I can. And that kind of love of dinosaurs and paleontology led into other things like a love of biology and zoology, and I've always kind of kept my love of those concepts in tandem with my love of art. And I think that was one of my main reasons for pursuing the art over the paleontology, was that with art I could do both in a way, where paleontology I may have to focus on one specific asset. I'm more of a traditional sculptor by trade. I really like working with actual clay, and what I had worked with most in the past in my previous jobs in mold making and fabrication for props and film. But I'd taken a lot of what I learned from those aspects and brought them into doing paleontology work and paleo art and reconstructing prehistoric animals. And I have honestly just started to get into computer generated art, or digital sculpting, I should say. But that's going to be more so the topic of the presentation today, is how do you take something like this, a beat up fossil of an ammonite shell, and then work with paleontologists to create an asset for something like this, a CG asset that can then be animated, posed in three-dimensional space, something like you might see on a television documentary, or like Walking with Dinosaurs was a very popular one. And that's something, an art form that I honestly never really thought I'd get into, but here I am, and I'm working with the museum to do many assets like this for the upcoming exhibit. So this presentation will kind of focus on the entire process from beginning to end of how do you take fossils and make an asset out of that, because it's a little bit more complicated than you might think if you have no background in any of it. And I'll be focusing specifically on Paleoparadoxia, which is one of the creatures from the upcoming exhibit, and it's also something that Gabe has a very fond attachment to. So anybody who knows Gabe knows that they have to bring in Paleoparadoxia at some point. But where do you start? Not all fossils are created equal, in a sense. And this fossil is not of Paleoparadoxia, but it's of a prehistoric seal. But the big thing here I want to demonstrate is that I personally would not know this from looking at it. Going through all this work, I would not know that this is a prehistoric seal in comparison to a paleoparadoxia or neoparadoxia. But I think that's where a big distinction that I've learned in the art comes from for things like this is there's a real connection between the role of the paleontologist and the role of the artist, and that yes, the artist is the person who is able to visualize a lot of these things, but you have to work on the framework and all the work that the paleontologists have put in to really try and dissect that information and have a framework to build on top of, rather than just going in and making drawings off of a collage of scattered bones. So when we first started, Jorge and I were looking at what was known about paleoparadoxia. And this is a mount from, I think, Berkeley, somewhere, a Berkeley museum.
Stanford.
It is Stanford. And this was tricky because we didn't have access to the actual skeleton. So we were doing some initial talking, and I was doing some sketches preliminarily based on what I could see here, but it's an older photograph. The quality is, compressed from being uploaded to the internet and everything, but that was kind of the best job that I could do at the initial outset. So I'd done a couple of these sketches, but then luckily enough, the paleontologist from Los Angeles who I'd been working with, Jorge, was able to inform me that we did have a paleoparadoxia that was in the Natural History Museum's collection. So from there, we were able to go into the museum, and I was able to do a pretty extensive cataloging of photos, hundreds of photos of from pretty much every conceivable angle, counting the vertebrae, making notes about how many ribs there were, making sure you got pictures of every bone in the wrist, teeth placement, where the nares was. And that's a big deal because, as you can kind of see between the two, they really look almost nothing alike. And part of that is just due to the first one, me not being able to be there and give it the same treatment. But also I found out later that the top of the skull is actually a fabrication or an approximation of what they think the top of the skull could look like, and not necessarily was any kind of preserved material. Where with the LA specimen, we were able to have more preserved material, and the paleontologists were able to go through and actually put it on a mount instead of just looking at something in say a slab of slate that, like with the seal skeleton, would be something that you'd actually have to go through and kind of do a bit more of a assemblage to get together. So it was very helpful to start with an actual mount that was positioned in the way that the scientists and the collections team think that it would be in life. Then it comes to kind of my favorite part once we've compiled all that, is the actual anatomy. I don't know why I particularly find this part the most fascinating, but I think it's when you start to actually put the pieces together, the puzzle pieces of, you've looked at this skeleton for so long, you've cataloged all the pieces, the paleontologist who you're working with has looked at the bones and they've only ever seen the bones, and now it's like the first steps into to actually getting something that is resembling your actual creature. And I think one of the big things that I learned, especially from this animal, was you have to think of two big topics. And the first is, what is it related to taxonomically? And what can you look at that it actually resembles? Because desmostelians, we think, are partially more related to manatees, dugongs, things like that, and even potentially elephants. But you wouldn't necessarily look at those things for the anatomy, right? Because those that don't conform to the same kinds of ecological niches that this animal would be living in. And the other thing about it is that it pretty much, for all intents and purposes, looks a lot like a hippo. So it might not necessarily be related to a hippo, but you can really start to put a lot of the pieces of the anatomy together by comparing it to things like a hippopotamus. And I think we were even looking at potentially, I think there was some kind of walrus anatomy that I looked at for the neck connection where it attaches to the back of the head. So I always find that kind of part of the puzzle to be a lot of fun. And then once we get the muscles attached, we can kind of start to play around with some variations. Things like where exactly the nostril would be positioned, how big the eye is, what kind of ears it had. Those aren't things that we necessarily have direct evidence for. So there's a little bit of wiggle room that we can play around with. So Jorge would always like to see things like this because we got to play around with how big the whiskers were, what the ears looked like, and he would pick combinations between, he liked aspects of A and aspects of B. And from there, we kind of make a composite out of all those features. And once that gets signed off on, we can kind of start to do a more in-depth diagram for the body. Now, if you notice that this drawing, the foot can look a little awkward the way it's positioned, even though it does conform to what the skeleton is. And that's a little bit of foreshadowing for later. But we do a more refined layout, and this is important because it basically is going to be the orthographic that I will be relying on later to be the foundation for the 3D model. And the feet were something that is very, very messy in this process. One of the big aspects of doing a 3D asset in comparison to, say, a 2D asset is that the requirements for this exhibit was that the 3D models would have to move around in space, right? It's not a 2D drawing where you can kind of pose it into something similar to the mount and rely on that as your evidence for why you did that. We actually have to think of the biomechanics of how this thing was moving. And that's difficult because these creatures have no modern analog. They are a series of creatures that don't have many other things to look from as far as reference. And one of the big problems that we had was with the feet. I tried to illustrate it here, but it's very awkward because the feet, the back feet of these animals actually face outward. Um, it's not the exact musculature system that we can really look at for any direct relatives. There's kind of a spur heel that comes out, but you can see the way that the fingers would curl. And the problem is when we looked into the literature of how these animals were supposed to swim, there really isn't much there. There's not much in the way of anything regarding Desmostilians, but that in particular, there was a little bit there about how they probably swam like a polar bear, where they kicked with their back legs and were using their big, powerful forearms to really propel themselves. But that didn't do us much good because the animator who takes the model after I finish modeling it has to relate that into an action and make it look convincing. And usually when you do that, you're using a real world analog as your reference point. And for this, we really had nothing like that. So if it looks like a hippo, it probably swims like a hippo, but probably not in this case, because while we might not know exactly how it swam, Desmosilians or specifically Paleoparadoxia, we know what the way we don't know exactly how the foot worked in conjunction with the rest of the leg, but from kind of an understanding of anatomy, you can put it together the things that it definitely couldn't do. And the animator Kane initially wanted to make this kind of more of a doggy paddle pose because we were looking at polar bears specifically. Jorge, the paleontologist, myself, and the animator Kane would have these little meetings where we're looking at videos trying to figure out how this thing would work. And initially, we wanted to go with a kind of a doggy paddle because it was probably the most conservative view. But the problem is with an understanding of anatomy, you can see where the heel is and where the flexor digitorum and the gastrocnemius would attach to the back of the femur. And in that, you can know that the ankle wouldn't twist to that degree to be able to lay flat and do kind of your traditional doggy paddle the way a bear or dog or yourself would swim in water. The feet were facing outward in kind of a natural pose as depicted by the actual mount. So how does that swim? What does that look like? So we had to go through a whole bunch of trial and error of figuring it out, and I was this interesting position of being the middleman between the paleontologist who understood the anatomy but couldn't visualize it, and Kane the animator who could visualize it but couldn't quite understand it. So we could look at exactly what the foot could and couldn't do. And we were trying to figure out the way that that foot would work. And we did this for weeks, actually. We went back and forth trying to figure out how it would fit. We debated about just breaking the foot because it would be easier to animate in the long run, but we knew that that would be a bad idea because it wouldn't make sense to inaccurately portray the animal for an exhibit that's obviously supposed to be portraying how it lived. But again, biomechanics of a prehistoric animal are always tricky. And eventually, I was pacing around or something, and I came up with the idea of just looking at it hundreds and hundreds of times that we're trying to give this creature an action that it didn't want to do. We're trying to make a square peg fit into a round hole. We know it's a four-legged animal. It looks like a hippo. We're trying to make it swim like a hippo. But that might not be the case, obviously. So eventually we're looking at the way that the feet splay out, and knowing that these creatures would eventually likely be related to manatees, I was thinking about just the back legs. If you were going to try and propel yourself, what would you do? Well, if you think about it, the positioning of the feet kind of in that way would give you a lot of lift if you were to use them in conjunction together, kind of like the way a mermaid swims or, say, a fluke for a dolphin, right? And this might not look like a dolphin, it might not even be related to a dolphin, but the action could be similar. If you put both your feet kind of close together and outward behind you, you kind of get the same action of a fluke. And that way you could use your big, powerful forearms and propel yourself out to sea, potentially with your back legs. And to do this, we I made this little clay mock-up of the the anatomy just to kind of demonstrate what it was that I was thinking, because it's so difficult to translate that into words. But instead of doing an actual full back leg motion, say like you would see with a bear or mostly any other four-legged animal, it's more of a up and down movement, kind of like the way you would swim, where you're kicking both your legs back and forth, but instead of back and forth, you may potentially be moving them up and down. And we really have no concrete evidence for this, but it is an option that could potentially solve the enigma of how this animal potentially swam. Uh, and I was very proud to think that I was potentially part of the rationale for why that decision was made. So from there, you have your model. You know how it wants to swim, and you've laid out your basic geometry. I use a program called ZBrush, which allows you to manipulate pixels and topology in real time. And we start with pretty much the same way that you would with a traditional sculpture, where you lay out your big masses first, and you check with the paleontologist to make sure that everything looks right. And this is overlaid directly from the orthographic drawings that were done earlier. But once you kind of start to put some fleshing and some mass on it, and it starts to come a little bit more to life, that's when the paleontologist really kind of gets excited and typically starts to see things a little bit more. And they say, well, okay, maybe the front legs would be bowed down a little bit, or maybe we'd have a little bit more webbing between the toes, or it would actually be positioned in a more natural aspect if it was curled a bit more. So basically, I've tried to translate the same process for how I work in clay in a traditional manner, and just kind of update that for a digital aspect. And then after you get your texturing and all the little details sculpted in, then becomes the real fun part of taking that creature and really giving the details that uh, really make it kind of come to life. And I think people start to connect with it more. The old saying, the soul is captured in the eyes. I always really love when I finally have the eyes in to a sculpture, because it really feels like it's not alive until you get the eyes in it. And once you get all the little details, things like the microvesseling in the skin, and the pores and the dimples, and the the hairs on the nose, like the rakes like would be in a walrus, the blood vessels in the eyes and nose, scratches, all those little details come together, then it's the most fun time for me, because it's the first time you get to really kind of stand back and appreciate all the work that you've put in up until that point. So when you're done, you get a final asset like this, which is where it can be lit, it's rendered, it's painted, it's textured, it's ready to go. It's ready to be given off to the animator, who can then manipulate it and pose it, and give it more life and making it swim. But you've laid upon this big groundwork of work, from taking it from the most bare aspect of just crushed bones, to a mount, to drawings, to figuring out the propulsion and how it moved and what it looked like when it moved. What kind of ecological niche did this creature inhabit? What role did it play in its environment? All those questions are things that need to be answered when creating something like this. And we, like I said earlier about just, we were thinking at some point of just making a doggy paddle, because that would have been easier for us to model and to animate. But it's important, I think, that we didn't take that shortcut, because things like this influence the way people understand this animal. This exhibit may be the first taste of desmostylians that a lot of people get. It's their first real introduction to them. And we might not know exactly what they did, but we know what they didn't as far as anatomy goes. And I think that's really cool to put those kind of forensic clues together and be able to make decisions like that. And who knows, maybe that line of thinking about the way that uh, paleoparadoxia could have propelled itself will go on and be more of a defining aspect in future papers. But it's infinitely cool to me that I potentially am able to put my thumbprint into the cultural understanding of how we view animals that don't exist anymore. And all these things exist in a 3D space so far, or I should say a digital space, but that's not always the case. Thanks to 3D printing, this was a print that we did of the exact model that was then airbrushed and colored, washed to make basically a physical model from the three-dimensional. So I think it's really cool that there's a real world of possibilities that you can take with this kind of art. And especially since it's an aspect of art I never really thought I would get into this heavily, for sure. I know I really liked sculpting traditionally. I was kind of trained as a classical illustrator, but every time I go and learn something new digitally, I see that there's some kind of aspect that I can apply paleo art to, and it just is constantly exciting for me. Something like this, 3D models are a cheap way to uh, anybody can look at a 3D model. There's, all you need is computer access, phone access. You can look at something in real space without actually having to be at a museum to see a physical model or even the skeleton anymore. There's 3D scanning technology, and I know that there are uh, some fossil mounts that you can see on your phone. Scroll back and forth and see them like they are in the actual museum. And I think that uh, digital reconstructions and things like this will hopefully start to play a bigger role in the future, because I think there's a great deal of not only educational opportunities, but also helping people understand why these, not just Desmostilians, but prehistoric creatures are worth investing time into, and why they're worth learning about, and why understanding these mysteries of things that we don't understand from our deep past is a path that is most definitely worth pursuing. So I thank you for anybody who's stuck with me this far. It means quite a bit to me to uh, let anybody let me teach them something. I'm very appreciative of that. So if anybody would like to contact me, you can get a hold of me on pretty much anything: Instagram, Twitter, or just go to my site. But again, thank you very much. I quite appreciate it. Let's see.
Cullen, I hope everyone has like that Desmostilian model you've created is locked away somewhere safe, because if I see it, I'm taking it home.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think Jorge might have put it on his coffee table,
Ah, man. Okay, I'm gonna
but
have to bug
but we
Jorge
can.
for that.
But that's the really cool part about doing the 3D modeling too, is that you're not just necessarily locked into one. This is an another thing from the this will also be in the exhibit, but it's a 3D print of the ammonite sculpture that I showed earlier. And this is fairly small, but it can be scaled up. And right now, another paleontologist and I are in the process of molding it and having that be potentially a model, a physical model in the exhibit in conjunction with the 3D asset. So, you can always print another one. The only rule is how much resin you have. But hey, once you have the model, sky's the limit. So,
All right, I'm gonna have to try to get that model for myself. But that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for sharing about like the whole process for creating these 3D models. I mean, a lot of folks might think that this technology it's not new, but the application of it is more widely spread in science, not just in movies and video games, but it's very much used in science nowadays. It's kind of it's not, I wouldn't say the standard, but would you say that like it might become the standard in the future?
I think there'll always be a place for the traditional side of things. I mean, even the sketches and things that I do, I still like to have a pencil in my hand, right? I draw better with a pencil than I do on a Wacom tablet, even though I use that for the digital sculpts that you saw. And I think it's the same rule that it is in art. It's everything is just a tool. What is the best tool to finish that job, or what is the best tool to convey that premise? And for doing something really big, a big outdoor sculpture, I mean, I really wouldn't recommend doing 3D modeling because at this point, it would be so cost prohibitive and time consuming and difficult just to cut that model up so many different times and then try to assemble it. You could just do the whole thing out of clay way easier. I still love working with clay and drawing and painting traditionally, but it's just I think the art side of things is you're constantly looking for new ways to realize the visions or the hallucinations that you get as an artist, right? It's what's the best tool for the job. And I'm hoping that 3D won't become the only tool. I'd like to think that it'll play a bigger role. I mean, it definitely has for film and entertainment. Um, but as far as paleontology goes, I think a lot of the 3D models are still they're not constantly scrutinized as hard as maybe say some of the 2D or the paintings or the clay sculptures are. So yeah, I'd like to think that it will become a bigger part, but I really wouldn't like to see it be the only part. I'd like to see it just be another tool in the sandbox for people to play with and interact with.
So when you're making these clay sculptures, like how long does it usually take for you to go from concept to like the finished sculpture, right? Compared to like doing the 3D model, um, like how much product does it take, and like how many hours do you find yourself just like trying to get all the fine details to be like sculpted out like that?
Um, with a traditional sculpture, it can take probably a couple months just from there's the heavy aspect of not only making sure that your armature is structurally sound and can support the weight of clay and things that will then be added onto it, but there's also the hard process of your armature and your final sculpture will not necessarily have the same pose. Once you start to add clay and layer things on, um, you're constantly going to have to check yourself and your shape and how it looks in conjunction from different angles and things, and also all the science and artwork that goes into just getting it off the ground is still the same compared to digital. So a traditional sculpture can take, I would say, for me at least, can take probably a couple months. But one of the great aspects of the 3D is that fabrication process is much more streamlined. Obviously, you're not working with real materials. You're not limited by a cost perspective, right? There's not necessarily a certain scale. You just have the program, you open it, you work on it, and it's done. It's not like water-based clay where you're worried about a material drying out or NSP where you have to heat it up before putting it on. And I think that's partially really freeing as an artist just to be able to go in there and start mucking around and going crazy. But definitely I'd say the details are the longest part for sure because like I said earlier, the devil's in the details. The details are the thing that's going to sell it. You can get all the proportions right, but if the skin texture doesn't look good, and you don't need to be an artist to say, "Oh, I know what an elephant or a hippopotamus skin texture looks like," and it's a good sculpture, but it looks kind of hokey, or I don't think he did a good job with the feet. The toes don't look quite right, or that connection point, and getting those traditionally or digitally, those little things that really sell you on this being a real animal, right? Scars, uh, broken vesicles, folds, how to fold, just the complexity of how skin and especially animal skin folds is something that I've dedicated years of my life just trying to figure out, and how other artists do such a great job at it. So, but I will say though, every time I'm working digitally for too long, I end up missing I miss clay. I want to go back to clay. I want to get my hands into a material and actually feel something. And then when I'm working in clay, I think this would be, doing something like this, or a pattern, a repeated pattern. This would be so much easier in digital. So, you know, can't have your cake and eat it too. But they're both great. I adamantly love them both.
Yeah, I like what you said about like the trying to study like the skin folds for like it's not probably something you thought you'd be spending so much time on. I know for like when I start just dabbling in drawing, like I hate hands. Hands are the worst thing I think for me to draw. But what is it about trying to translate something into art when it's something that we see all the time, right? Like we see skin folds on animals, you see all those minute details and like art for me the hands, but when you're trying to transfer it to art, what is it about that transfer that sometimes we just can't get perfect even though it's so commonplace to us?
I don't know if I have a great answer, but as somebody who's gone through what all artists have, is trying to constantly get better at, you know, drawing and sculpting and painting, is there's always that filter between what you're seeing and how your brain processes it, and how that processing in your brain is translated to your canvas, right? I don't know what it is about that process, but you know, you can't match it. Some people can just match colors that they see perfectly without a moment of hesitation. They know exactly how much purple to put into blue to make a violet or something, right? They just know they can do it without a hitch. And that was something that I personally struggled with for a long time, uh, when I was trying to learn how to paint and do things like that. So, but the more I did it, and the more I found myself, I'd walk around just all day, and I'd see something, and I would just a mundane object or tree or something, and I'd say, what colors would I mix to get that color? And I would kind of be doing these thought experiments in my head all day long, just like, like a pop quiz kind of a thing. And then when I started to try and actually apply that, I felt like that fog in my head between what I was seeing and how it got filtered back to my hand would maybe be a bit clearer. There wasn't as much fog in my brain to convolute it, and I think, um, that's just the process that it takes. Is, myself or Mark Hallett or, anybody will just tell you that, the more you can do it and the more you can practice it, the easier it will be. But art is always difficult because you have to translate something that somebody who isn't an artist can look at and say, that doesn't look right. You could have no background in art and just know something doesn't look right to you. But the question is why. And I think studying what it is that doesn't look right is just as important as practicing constantly to try and make something look right.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess that means I should probably get my sketchbook and just draw hands all day next time.
Yeah, unfortunately.
That's okay. We've got a great question from Jared McGowan. So Jared is asking, my main question as a paleo artist is how do you entice museums to reach out to you about your portfolio and potential future projects?
That's a tough one. Um, it's something that I'm personally still trying to figure out. There's no real course of action that you can follow, but I would say that, if there is a museum that is close to you or that you're particularly fond of, like, myself, I'd been going to the LA County Museum, my entire life. It was kind of like my hometown hero museum in kind of a way. And I was able to introduce myself to a couple people just through mutual contacts, and then you just keep on building that repertoire. But I would say the biggest hurdle is really getting that first introduction. It's not so much your art, it's more meeting the people and making sure that you're kind of in their Rolodex of, if they think of something and then can relate it to you, then they can call you. I know Mark Hallett said earlier that he volunteered with museums for preparatory reasons and things, preparing fossils. And if you're there all day and they know you and they know that you draw, they'll probably go to you first, right? Um, there's artists out there who, they're such a big name or they're such a main draw that they're lucky enough that they have rock star status, so that artists will go to them. But I guarantee you that they didn't just start out hoping that museums would come to them with their art. Either you have to be, publishing things on like social media a lot, which I'm personally not good at, but there's other avenues too. You can do social media. There's and even reaching out to people on social media too is a great way. I found that most of the people who I've reached out to through on Instagram or even Twitter, they're more than willing to talk to you. When I was working on that fish sculpture earlier, if you were here for that, I had big questions on that, and I just reached out to somebody on Instagram who then linked me to somebody on Twitter, and he was from the University of Michigan. I would have never known he existed, but he was a fossil fish expert. And then he and I became friends, and he helped me and answered questions on that project, and uh, he and I still talk, and we haven't worked together yet, but maybe there's some things in the works down the future. And I'd say focus on the art, sure, and posting and everything, but also if you can, just make as many connections as you can. Reach out to reach out to people on the internet. I'd say first, and maybe they can get you into the museum and you can meet people in person, and then they'll always introduce you to more people. So it's very long-winded, but it's a problem that I myself face. So, and unfortunately, there's no extremely clear answer. So I greatly sympathize with you for wanting the most direct answer possible.
I think that's a great answer because it's like, sometimes it's that building that network and starting is so daunting sometimes. But once you meet that first person, can open so many doors. I mean, I think we were just talking before we went on live, Colin, that you came to the museum to one of our events, and that's kind of how we met. And then like you messaged me on my email, and we were able to talk, and that's how those kind of connections are made. So if you really want to go out there, don't have the mindset of like, how do I get them to contact me? You know, be brave and
Yeah,
like
definitely.
go out there and contact them. Send messages. Be polite. don't put too many out there at once. But yeah, just send an email, send them a DM, and see who answers back. A lot of times, most of us in the world of paleo, if that's what you want to get into, we are friendly people most days. We want to help out. So, send a message to us.
I will say
Um,
that I'll say that every paleontologist who I've reached out to has been exceptionally nice to me. When I first started, I very much struggled with feeling like uh, my work wasn't up to par with uh, the people who I idolized or the people who I saw posting on Twitter all the time. But I was still able to meet those people, and they were very nice to me. And as long as, like Gabe said, you're polite, and I think you can express that you have a genuine interest in paleontology, biology, the fields in which these people work, that they'd love to talk to you all day about what it is that they do. So,
Very true. And so Cullen showed me those Desmostilian stuff. I know. If you contact me and send me Desmostilian pictures, I will happy talk to you for hours on end. I'm just letting you know now. Here's another question, Cullen. I think you mentioned some of the programs, but what programs do you use for digital sculpting? And any recommendations for how to train someone who's most comfortable with hand tools, how to effectively sculpt using 3D software?
for sculpting, I use a program called ZBrush. Um, and for the texturing, coloring, painting, I use a software called Substance Painter. They're both pretty much industry standard programs for entertainment assets, things for movies, things like that. Um, and there's a pipeline basically of how the assets are created. You have the programs like ZBrush, where they actually create the polygons and form them into your model. Then there's programs like Maya that uh, take those polygons and create better topology. So it's a bit more of you've seen 3D models where it's like a wireframe mesh. That's basically the process of UVing and creating a map over the 3D sculpture that you've made in ZBrush. And then once you have that map, you can import it into Substance Painter and paint on top of. As far as getting started in it, um, there's always the problem of the barrier of entry, right? You need the hardware to run it. You need a computer that can process and handle ZBrush, and you need to be able to get the programs first, legally or anyway. But a lot of people I know start with like Blender. I personally did not, but Blender does try to bridge a lot of those gaps into one program. From my understanding, Blender is a great tool for a lot of different things, but it's maybe not as nuanced as ZBrush is for sculpting or Substance Painter is for detailing. But it's free and it's probably a great way to start. I mean, if it's free and your computer can run it, there's oh my gosh, there's thousands of YouTube tutorials, and I will be honest with you, I've just watched thousands of tutorials for all kinds of programs. ZBrush has their own line of tutorials that are free on YouTube that you can watch that will get you pretty good, pretty quick with the understanding of the interface and things. But 3D programs definitely are daunting, and they're daunting for me too, even learning new ones because you know what it is that you want to do, right? If like you said, you're coming from a traditional sculpting background, you understand how clay can be overlaid on something and how to detail things by hand and get certain textures that way, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the same technique digitally. So I'd say pretty much the only thing you can really do is just get your fingers in it and just be constantly playing around with it. Um, the models that I'm doing do not look like the models that I did when I started. The models that I started with a couple years ago were terrible, honestly. They were very bad. I didn't know anything, but every time I learned one new thing that I could apply, it was like I treated it as kind of a milestone, right? It's important because once you figure out how to do something that corrects something that you didn't like, then you can apply that each time. And once you apply that each time, you're you're creating a better pipeline for how you approach the creation of something. But definitely that kind of fear of just going in and opening the program and seeing all the menus and file options and things is particularly daunting. Um, I know there's classes, there's online classes depending on where you are in the world that you can take. I know places like Flip Normals is a website where they do great tutorials. I personally learned Substance Painter through them. They're not paying me. They just do really nice tutorials that you can buy for fairly cheap. Um, and I'd say really it's like anything else. You know, you just got to get in there and screw it up a whole bunch of times before you get anything that looks halfway decent. But just because the first time you do it, you don't understand it or it looks bad doesn't mean that you should stop. It just means that you didn't do it that good that time, right? It's not it's a cumulative thing, right? I don't show people my first sculpts for a reason. Like I said, they're terrible. You know, there's no point in showing you the things that I first did, but that doesn't mean I was always able to sculpt or learn or know 3D software this well. Um, it, yeah, just keep working with it, keep trying it, you know, depending on how much time and effort you're able to put into it, or if it's something that you really want to pursue professionally, then definitely. The time that it takes to screw up, do something wrong, save it as the wrong file type and not be able to open it up in a different program, each time you screw something up and solve it is the most, or in my opinion, the best learning that you could do because it's directly showing you by memory how not to do something. And then once you learn that, that just becomes another tool that you can use to get better. So
Awesome.
hopefully that answered your question. It's a real tough one just to, you know, I purposely made the um, presentation more about the conceptual aspects because I didn't want it to just be uh, a tutorial on how to use ZBrush. So I hope that that answered your question.
I think that was great advice. I mean, we were talking about this too before we went on air. Like, sometimes you just have to take that leap. I think there's a lot of people nowadays who think that you have to be perfect at something or like really really good at something before you can go out there and show it to the world before you can even just dabble. There's like dabbling in something is not like worth trying anymore. It seems like it's either you have to do it perfectly before you can go out there, but that's not a great way to try things. And you know, you'll never get better unless you just go ahead and start. Like Cullen said, like I've tried Blender before. I've opened that and I was like, I don't know what the heck any of these buttons or menus do. And I went on YouTube and then like, you know, a couple hours later, I knew how to make a little circle at least in Blender. I'm sure it's a lot easier than that. I'm just not really great at the program. But at least I tried, right? So I think that was great advice, Cullen.
I will
We're coming up.
say, oh, sorry.
No, go
I'd
ahead.
say
Go.
just last kind of aspect to that. I will say the best 3D sculptors I know also sculpt in clay. So if you really want to learn 3D sculpting, don't think that only, you know, focusing on learning Blender or ZBrush or whatever is, you know, you just have to get amazing at ZBrush and your life will be perfect. All the things that I know how to do sculpting detail wise, I do because I grew up sculpting traditionally, and that was kind of really where I fell in love with sculpting and creating things. So if you come from that same background, you know, I would argue that it'll help you. Knowing traditional sculpting will help you. And if you don't come from that background, you know, give clay a shot. You know, you can pick. I use a clay called NSP Chavant. It's pretty common in most art stores. It's a wax-based clay. You might need to heat it up in kind of like low settings on an oven or like a heat lamp to get it malleable. But practicing how to do things in real life with clay and tools will be infinitely easier to learn how to do digitally. It'll be I can't express to you. I should have said that first. If you can do it by hand and have it on clay, you can do it digitally. Um, I would say that would help too if you didn't already try clay.
Awesome. Well, we're running out of time. Uh, Thank you so much, Cullen, for this great presentation and all the great advice on really how you can create use 3D for paleontology. Is super interesting. Again, I'm gonna try to steal the Desmostilians. So, uh,
I'll make one for you. I'll make one
cool.
for you.
So before we end, is there any last piece of advice you'd want to share with our audience, or even kind of where they can go to learn more about your work?
Um, my website is just cullentownsenddesign.com. If you have any questions or about either contacting me or just advice, feel free to reach out to me on anything. Again, if you're polite, I'll always respond. And I'd say if you're really looking at pursuing anything art related, paleontology, paleo art, traditional art, it's always difficult to see other people who do the thing that you love better than you, no matter what. But if you really love it and you're really fascinated by it, never stop trying. Never stop trying to do sketches. Never stop trying to just be interested and curious about learning about these things. Um, I'd have no real formal training in paleontology or science, but I've just through kind of training myself and drawing animals and seeing how other people draw animals, it's given me a huge index on how to approach uh, traditional sculpture, 3D software, and the way that I do my own art. And I might be able to be doing things for exhibits, but that doesn't mean that I've always been confident in myself in any way whatsoever, especially art. So, if you see this and you're daunted and you think that, oh God, I was interested in it, but now it seems so complicated, I don't know if I want to do it. That's probably the worst thing I could feel, is that it intimidated you away from not wanting to try it. I would much rather hope that this inspired you to try it, and I would argue that if you're really interested, go ahead and get your feet in. You can ask me questions. I'll try and help to my best of my ability. Uh, Feel free. I mean, the world is your oyster. Go for it.
Well, thank you so much, Colin, and thanks so much to everybody for joining us today on Discovery Day Online. We'll put all the links to Colin's sites and social media in the description below. And if you like this program and want to support programs like it at the Alf Museum, you can find links on how to do that in the description below as well. Thanks everybody. Thanks everybody so much for watching. We'll be back at 3 o'clock with our final guest for today, Kate Fileshifter. And she actually works in the entertainment industry, and she'll be talking about how she uses science and art to create creature design. So we'll be back at 3. Thanks everybody so much. Make sure you like and subscribe for more stories from the world of paleontology. Bye everybody.